In our last mini lecture, we talked about elicited behaviors, which are automatic, involuntary responses to some stimulus in the environment. In this lecture, we'll talk about what happens when an eliciting stimulus is presented over and over. So one of two things will happen to your behavior when you present this stimulus over and over. Either you will habituate or you will sensitize to that stimulus. With habituation, there is a decrease in the strength of an elicited behavior following repeated presentations of that stimulus. So the more that you are presented with the stimulus, the less intense your response will be. So we've all experienced this. You go into a room, you smell a strong odor. At first, it's very overwhelming. It demands your attention. You stay in that room, meaning you're presented with the stimulus repeatedly, and over time, you no longer respond to the smell. You can no longer even smell the odor in the room because you have habituated to that stimulus. Sometimes you'll go into a room and there will be a fluorescent light, and you will hear the buzzing of that light. At first, it's very distracting. The longer you stay in the room, you habituate to it, and you eventually no longer hear that buzzing. The same thing can be said with the ticking of your watch. If you're wearing a new watch, the ticking may be very distracting to you in the beginning, but over time you habituate to it and you no longer respond to that ticking of your watch. So habituation tends to be very stimulus specific, meaning if the stimulus changes in any way, your responding will go back up to the previous level. You will dishabituate to that stimulus. So for example, if for some reason the fluorescent light in the classroom is buzzing in a particular way, if the way it buzzes changes, or if it were to stop buzzing for a second and start buzzing again, you would dishabituate, meaning that you would lose that low level of responding. You'd go back to the previous higher level of responding, because if the stimulus changes in any way, you tend to recover your responding to that stimulus. The second response to the repeated exposure to a stimulus would be to sensitize. So when you have sensitization, you tend to increase the strength of an elicited behavior following repeated presentations of that stimulus. So this would be like a soldier who is at war. If you are repeatedly exposed to bombings and gunfire, you tend to get very on edge. You tend to develop PTSD symptoms where you're very hypervigilant. You tend to over-respond to these stimuli. And whereas when you habituate, it tends to be very stimulus specific. When you sensitize, it tends to generalize to other stimuli. So a soldier who is very sensitive to the sound of bombs and gunfire would also be very sensitive to the sounds of a balloon popping or a car backfiring. So this response tends to generalize to other stimuli that are similar. So something that can happen with a habituated response is it can dishabituate. So this is where a habituated response reappears following the presentation of a seemingly irrelevant novel stimulus. So take the example of the buzzing of the light in the classroom. If you habituated to that sound, you're no longer responding to the sound, and then a smoke alarm were to go off. Once that alarm goes off, you again would hear the buzzing of the light. You would no longer be habituated to it. So that introduction of some seemingly irrelevant novel stimulus can interrupt that habituation process. So your low level of responding goes away. It goes back up to the previous higher level of responding. Now you can apply this theory to relationships. We know in the beginning of a relationship, you're very excited. You have a high level of responding to that person. Over time, you're repeatedly exposed to them and you tend to habituate. Your level of excitement, your level of responsiveness to that person tends to decrease over time. So you can cause dishabituation by introducing some novel stimulus. So this can be something like going on a trip. So you're changing your environment. It could be changing your perfume, changing your cologne, changing your hair. So interrupting that habituation process can cause you to go back to your previous higher level of excitement, higher level of responsiveness to this person. So what determines whether you habituate or sensitize to a stimulus? So typically, we habituate to low intensity stimuli. So again, things like the ticking of the watch, the buzzing of the light, low intensity, we tend to we tend to habituate to low intensity stimuli. When there is a high intensity stimulus, something like gunfire, explosions, we tend to sensitize. So we tend to get more sensitive, more reactive to those type of stimuli. And if you have a stimulus of moderate intensity, you tend to go through a period of being sensitized, followed by a period of habituating to that stimulus. Something that also plays into whether we habituate or sensitize is the evolutionary significance of the stimulus. So take two stimuli that are at the same level of intensity. So take the smell of garlic and onions, which would be a high intensity smell, and also take the smell of rotting meat, which is also, a high intensity smell. We're more likely to habituate to the smell of garlic and onions and more likely to sensitize to the smell of rotting meat. And why is that? As far as our survival, the smell of onion and garlic is not a threat to us. So we tend to habituate to that. We tend to, over time, respond less to that. Whereas the smell of rotting meat could have very serious implications for our survival. If we were to habituate to the smell of rotting meat, meaning over time we could no longer smell it, we might eat that rotting meat. And so in order to counteract that, we tend to sensitize to things like that. So whether we habituate or sensitize does depend on the intensity of the stimulus, but also can be tied to evolution and how serious the stimulus has consequences for our survival. So what is the purpose of these two reactions to stimuli? So habituation and sensitization are closely tied to survival, like we talked about. It helps us sort stimuli into those things that require our immediate attention and those things that do not require our attention. So it allows us to kind of tune out things in our environment that don't cause a threat to us, don't pose a threat to us. We tune out things that are not very important, and we tune into those things that require our attention. So oftentimes people think about people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD as being unable to pay attention, and that is not the case. They can pay attention, but they typically have difficulty controlling their attention. So they have difficulty controlling what they pay attention to, and they may be distracted by and pay too much attention to things that are irrelevant in their environment. So in a classroom, most of us can tune in to the teacher speaking and tune out, other discussions in the classroom, the sound, the buzzing of the lights, the sound of the AC. But a person with ADHD, they may be focused on other conversations. They may be distracted by the sound of the buzzing of the lights. They may be distracted by the sound of the AC running, and they can't pay attention to the teacher because too much of their attention is focused on these other things. So it's not that they can't pay attention, they just have difficulty controlling and directing their attention. So habituation and sensitization have to do with a stimuli bringing about two differing responses. And that is also the case with the opponent process theory of emotion. So this theory explains why certain emotions are elicited by a stimuli, and it involves two opposing emotions being called up or elicited by the same stimulus. Okay, so let me give you an example of the opponent process theory of emotion. We really break down what it is. Okay, let's say that your happiness level is at about a 5. So you're not extremely happy, you're not extremely unhappy, you're at a moderate level of happiness. Then you believe that you won the lottery. So your emotion or your happiness would shoot up to a 10. So because you think you won the lottery, your happiness went from a 5 to a 10. You soon learn that you have an old lottery ticket from a couple of weeks ago. You did not win this week's lottery. So that event of winning the lottery has been taken away. So you would think that your emotion would then decrease, your happiness would then decrease back to a level of 5, back to where it was before you thought you won the lottery. But that is not what we see. We see that your happiness level would descend even lower than that previous level of 5. So your happiness level after realizing that you didn't win the lottery might be a 3, as opposed to before you even thought that you won the lottery, your happiness was at a 5. And So the opponent process theory of emotion would say an emotional event, in this case, thinking you won the lottery, causes two competing processes. First, you have the primary process or the A process, which is elicited by the event. So the event of thinking you won the lottery causes the A process, and the A process is that feeling of happiness. So the event of winning the lottery causes the A process, which is that feeling of happiness. Then there's a secondary process, the B process. The B process is caused by the A process. So the B process is a reaction to the A process. And the purpose of the B process is to counteract the A process and maintain homeostasis. So we know that our bodies like to be at a level of balance and homeostasis. So we like to avoid extreme highs and lows within our body. So because you experience extreme happiness in reaction to thinking you won the lottery, your body is then going to excrete hormones and neurotransmitters to try to bring that mood back down to a level, a normal level. But when the event is withdrawn, so winning the lottery is withdrawn, is taken away, the A process quickly ends. So that happiness quickly ends. But the B process tends to remain longer and it tends to decrease more slowly. So when you realize you didn't win the lottery, that event is taken away, the happiness ends quickly, but the B process, which is trying to pull your mood back down to normal, it lasts longer and decreases more slowly, so your mood is pulled down below the previous level of happiness. This can work in both directions. So several years ago, I was involved in a very serious car accident. For several days, it was really, unclear about whether I would live or not. So the event of being in the car accident and fearing for my life caused the A process of me being very scared and very depressed. Our bodies don't like to exist in those extremes of emotion. So I had this B process that was making me feel happier, trying to pull my mood back up. So after a few days, when I realized that, I wasn't going to die, my mood was not at a moderate level. My mood was very high because I still had that B process, even though the A process had ended. So people would come and visit me in intensive care in the burn unit, and I would be in a great mood. I'm entertaining people. I'm having these great conversations, and people are like, "What is wrong with you? You almost died. Why are you in such a great mood?" But it was that B process trying to elevate my mood to counteract the A process of the sadness and the fear. And so I'm really not sure if this diagram helps, but this is looking at the stimulus being the shock and the behavioral response being heart rate. So you have that first dotted line, a shock is started, and the A process causes the animal's heart rate to shoot up. So the A process causes an increase, the B process starts and brings that line back down. So we're looking at this solid line that says net result. So the A process immediately causes an increase in heart rate. The B process starts and brings that heart rate down. So the heart rate is just above normal during the process of the shock. Then you have that second vertical dotted line. The shock goes off, so that A process that's elevating the heart rate stops, and all you have is the B process that's pulling the heart rate back down. So you see that solid line that says net result goes below the normal heart rate, and the heart rate is pulled down until over time that B process wears off and the heart rate goes back up. So with the repeated presentation of the emotional event or the stimulus, the B process increases in strength and duration. So that B process gets stronger and lasts longer the more times you're exposed to the eliciting event that causes the A process. So this has implications for relationship violence. So think about if there's an act of abuse, your A process is going to be to bring your mood down. You're going to feel depressed, fearful, maybe even lonely. Your body then is going to counteract those negative emotions with a B process, may raise your emotion. So you're going to have this B process that then increases your emotion. You feel happier, you feel more content. When that event of abuse is removed, that A process goes away and the B process remains. So you have those positive feelings. And the more times you're exposed to abuse, the stronger and the longer that B process is. So, it sounds paradoxical, it sounds unexpected, but the more you're exposed to that trauma, the stronger that B process gets, the longer it lasts. So you get more of a positive emotion after the abuse is removed, the more times you've been through this process of abuse. So that gives you a little bit of insight into the way the cycle of abuse may be influenced by the opponent process theory of emotion.